artists around the world. Teaching artists around the world. Artists around the world. Teaching artists around the world. Well, just to say, I've seen so many wonderful faces and so many new faces. My name is Nato Thompson. Welcome to the Alternative Art School Visiting Artist Talks. We not only have artists that are attending now, but also previous artists from the school, and people from our newsletter are in attendance. And of course, for those newsletter people, just to lay out our ulterior motive, is we're trying to get you to take a class at the school. Come on down to Waters Farm. Sorry, it's also spring break, and my son is becoming, absorbed by video game culture. So anyways, we're more than thrilled and excited to present a mentor to me, an inspiration, and certainly an incredibly important artist in the field of, name them, there's a long list, but certainly I would say a poetics that hits the ground running in terms of social impact. How's that for a genre? Suzanne's currently over at USC, but she's certainly a West Coast artist from the LA area for a long time, originally from Appalachia. And not only is she an incredible artist, but if you ever get to a chance to read her books, she's absolutely a brilliant, insightful writer that can teach us a lot about the power of community and art. It's all true. It's all verifiable. Now listen, Suzanne, we'll work with you to kind of get the lecture going, but we are meant to be somewhat of a social, informal kind of place. So, I think it's a great opportunity to introduce your work to our artists that are in attendance, but also we're going to try to have some Q&A so they can prod you and ask some questions as well. So welcome, Suzanne Lacy.
Thank you. Do you want Q&A, Nato, while I talk, or
No. Just
after?
because I know how that goes, especially with you, like it'll who knows the direction. Let's have a little piece of meat and then we'll chop it up.
All right, good. Thank you all. I mean, it's a little early for me, particularly when I got up late, but it's lovely to see my former student and really great artist friend, Claudia from Borgna from Italy. And it's lovely to see Lauren Bond, who I work with, and Lauren and I will be teaching a class together at USC this summer, a 2-week class. And Lauren has given me such great feedback, Nato, on your program and teaching in your program. I've got about 4 projects. The problem is the projects are long and they involve videos to explain. There's multi-year projects. So I'm going to start and get as many of them done as I can, but we can also, Nato, you and I know each other for so long that you can feel free to just say, hey, Suzanne, let's have a halt when you sort of sense a different tempo to things. So let me share the screen if I can get back to the damn Zoom. Hold on, there we go. There, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, and you see that it's now in, let me put it in slideshow. So I want to start with a project that Nato and I worked on, so hopefully I can embarrass him a little, that Between the Door and the Street with Creative Time. It was, what's interesting about it for me, among many things, I actually love the project, but what's interesting is that it, in a sense, was the first project where I began to work in the street and then think more carefully about how that work shows up in museums. And I've shown this in multiple museums, but that's kind of the theme that I want to talk about, is working in different kinds of contexts with different kinds of formal media. And in a sense, Between the Door and the Street starts with a project called Frieze Frame in 1982. I've always seen the intersectionality of feminism, racism, and class, also age, the various kinds of discriminations that we manage to make in our particular US culture. And in Frieze Frame, I brought together 120 women in different groups. That was the, they called themselves, the first group was they called themselves the supporters of the arts. I knew them as the rich ladies. These are the women that are prostitutes. They're all sitting in various furniture settings in the Roche-Beaubois furniture showroom. And they're talking all about survival in their different contexts. And the audience could move. You can see some of them there in the corner. They could move from setting to setting, and they could listen to these informal conversations that the groups had determined for themselves. In this case, it's women who had been institutionalized for mental illness. And these women then came together at the very end, and they all addressed the audience directly. It was very moving. It was improvisational, except, you know, the settings were choreographed and the coming together was choreographed. And the reason I'm showing this older work is that NATO approached me in 2012, I think it was. I was working on a project in London and super frustrated with the fact that intersectionality was really hard for me to generate with Tate Modern. And so NATO and I talked about what is contemporary feminism and how were people thinking differently? How were they reframing various forms of activism where I might have considered it earlier feminism? And most of you in the audience will at least be aware of the controversy that goes on having to do with the belief that 70s feminists were white middle-class women, which they weren't, but that's the belief. And what I was interested in was sort of listening and looking at various activists in New York and trying to understand what the differences were from when I began work as a feminist and experiences of people today. Most of my work is about kind of posing various aesthetic questions and social questions at the same time and trying to kind of come to an understanding of what those are. So here we are in the street of Between the Door and the Street, but going back to the Brooklyn Museum, a co-sponsor with Creative Time. This is the text that we put on the surface of the museum. And then a few blocks away, we asked for the participation of every homeowner on the street and turned up with 360 performers and about 62, I think it was, almost every stoop. And every stoop was important for some of the aesthetic questions. And one of the things we needed to accomplish in this was, how do you create a unifying aesthetic in this closed street? So obviously one thing is you want to occupy all the stoops. You don't want several missing. You want it like a giant stage setting when we closed off the beginning and the end of the street. And then we used the color yellow as a very light aesthetic unifier. And you can see the yellow line that nobody in the beginning understood why I insisted on putting in the street. There's a yellow line, there's yellow bouquets, and there's yellow scarves that sort of begin to tie the street together. And these groups were speaking based on a set of pre-established questions that they themselves, all 360 of them, had input into, and the group leaders had all helped formulate. So they were all talking about the same thing, but they were talking about it through different lenses. At the end, as the evening came on, people moved into the street, again, choreographed timing-wise, but they moved into the street, and the performers and the audience were able to talk together and eat food and so on. And here comes the first attempt to show you a video. Let me see if I can get that up.
And then we're going to slowly be kind of coming out, tablecloth, and then they're going to peel off to the right, walk all the way back down.
I think they're doing something with women and poverty. That's what I believe.
Yeah, feminism.
The most important thing about this project is how many of you have come together to construct it. This is a symbolic gesture. Whatever you feel, whatever you want to say, that is completely up to you.
straight. It was very like, he was like, still like very tough love, but very gentle with me. And like, oh, because you're a girl, you can cry, and that's okay. But now that I'm like, no, daddy, I'm queer, and I embrace both genders. It's like very like, oh, you don't need to cry, like suck that up, you know. Very like, it's more like
All my life, I've been accustomed to hearing men say hi gorgeous, and I say hi. I just know they're talking to me. He said hi gorgeous. My goddaughter said hi. I'm like, what? I'm middle-aged now.
This is what you see on the news after there's a domestic violence homicide all the time. I had no idea. He seems so nice. It's because their issue is not anger management. It's power. It's control. It's
Sometimes I
coercion.
feel like asking my mom some things that I don't know, but maybe I cannot ask her because she don't know nothing about it. She didn't go to
Not a
school.
piece of me. I'm like, talk to me like I'm your daughter or your sister or your mother. Don't talk to me like I'm your next
what
door.
is something you want for your daughter's education? It could be the same.
I wanted to assimilate so much and I wanted to blend in so
Background
bad.
of the victim isn't taken into account because then you're not tough on crime.
Your body doesn't feel young, but your soul feels young. Your spirit
yeah.
feels
How do we bring to light the feminization of poverty?
You know, it's not every day that we shut down our city blocks for things other than tube socks and Italian sausages. So to do something that really has a profound transformation of our individual lives and our collective lives, I think is very exciting for people.
What you see here is the result of extensive relationships that at its fruition are these 400 people having a conversation. And so in many ways, the project's in some ways already finished by the time that the people come to see it.
Bring back memories, NATO.
Ah,
Okay, so
that's such a good project. Congratulations.
it was good. And you know, what's interesting is recently, hold on, let me get back to slideshow.
And Pastek also cracks me up with that tube socks and sausages line.
Yeah, right. I want to go on to 3 more recent projects, but the interesting thing for me, besides the fact that I really like Between the Door and the Street, kind of aesthetically and socially and temporally, the way it went off as a performance. I then went back and created a 3-screen installation that the Brooklyn Museum now owns. And one of the things I want to talk about with these next 3 works is how I've explored over the past few years a couple of things, but one of them is the question of the authenticity of the work in the community and its authenticity in the gallery or the museum setting. And often you see things in museums that look very social practice-y. You know, they're real large-scale video installations or lots of photos and stuff, and it's very hard to penetrate the actual work as it existed within the community and its authenticity. So in Dito Pugna y Letra, by your fist in your hand, this is a kind of double entendre meaning about both. It's not about domestic violence, although the project was. It's about it's in Spanish, the of your fist and your hand, or of your fist and your writing. This project began in Ecuador long before I arrived. It was a project where about 10,000 women had written direct personal experiences of family violence, and they had given them to a foundation that had started the project. And when I heard about this, I felt it was very interesting to build upon the work that had been done before. So I worked with a man named Tim Kroger. I actually worked with hundreds of people on this project, but it was through the city of Quito in Ecuador. but Tim had been working with men and violence and created a 3-day intensive seminar for about 30 men who then went out into the community and worked with other men. We recruited high school, college people. We recruited people from the nonprofit sector and people from the city sector. And we created a performance that would take place in the bull ring with men reading these letters, first going to workshops, sometimes only of an hour or two in length, sometimes 3 days. They would go to workshops and they would do exercises and think about the root causes of violence as perpetrated by men. And then they would read these letters from this bull ring. And so here is a rehearsal. And here is sort of 3 layers. This is the directing team. And then this is the day of the event and the audience coming in. The directing team, you can see them as sort of up in the top there. Actually, I think this photo is from that angle. And this piece was done in, hold on, let me get back if I can. Yeah, there. This piece was produced over a 3-year period of time, as I said, with a team of about 10 artist collaborators from various sectors and, you know, men that were organizing, women that were organizing, and so on. So there were quite a few people behind the scenes for this. And this is the event that we produced. Hold on.
Muchas personas dicen que sus recuerdos de infancia son los más bellos. Recuerdan sus juegos y alegrías. Mis recuerdos son diferentes.
Cierta tarde un hombre bonachón me dijo que me llevaría a tomar helados. Pero en vez de eso me besó con fuerza, me levantó la pequeña falda del uniforme e introdujo sus dedos en mí.
Cuando yo tenía 6 años vi como mi papá pegó a mi hermano mayor. Le pegó tan fuerte que no pudo dormir en la noche del dolor que sentía de los golpes. Decía que tenía un hueso roto.
Un día, la madre llegó temprano y observó a su esposo manoseando a su hijita pequeña. Ella...
I need to let you know that if you've experienced violence and you want to turn this off, the sound off on this for the next couple of minutes, that you know, feel free to do that. Sorry, I didn't warn you in advance.
No dijo nada por temor a perder a su marido o miedo de qué dirán.
Yo me despertaba vomitando sangre, me pegaba con correa militar, me rompía el cuerpo a correazos. Cansada de tanto golpe, tomé veneno porque ya no soportaba más.
Pero están dispuestos ellos a trabajar, a mirarse en su propio dolor, en la historia de violencia del que ellos también fueron víctimas, y hacer algo.
Los niños aún duermen. Espero que anoche no hayan oído los golpes secos que me diste para ahogar esa rabia que te inundaba. Porque tú lo dices siempre, sin ti no soy nada. Pero me pregunto, ¿qué soy yo a tu lado?
Ya eran las 7 de la noche, hora en la que se supone que mi marido llegaba. Él había llegado violada por los amigos de mi esposo.
La primera bala la recibí en el estómago. Fue la única que pudo ser sustraída de mi cuerpo. La segunda bala. Hoy, en este día, me cargo la dura tarea de denunciar. No queden impunes.
Me casé hace 54 años. Sufría maltrato verbal y físico durante todos estos años y ahora en mi vejez tuve el valor para dejarle.
No importa quién es el receptor de una carta, cuando todos somos depositarios y autores de estas palabras que al juntarse, al significarse unas con otras, se encarnan y forman el cuerpo de hombres, niñas y mujeres. ¿Quién entonces se lleva la autoría de los cuerpos que cargan con toda esta violencia? El recuerdo es en carne viva. Está en mí, está en mi cuerpo, es lo que soy, está en cada una de estas palabras.
¿Puedo leerte mi carta?
¿Te puedo leer mi carta?
¿Me permites leerte mi carta?
So what you see is that the men are reading letters, more and more of them in the bull ring, and then as they begin to climb out of the bull ring and receive their candles, that they begin to read the letters and walk through the audience and sit down in groups and intimately read their letter. And each of those men have a different letter from the 10,000 pool of 10,000 letters. And that's about 350 people. So now if we're back to, so the thing that I wanted to mention about that project is that that documentary doesn't work well in galleries or museums. And it's good to show what happened at the performance, but I went back a year later and created a 5-screen video installation where men were standing around the circle of these installed videos, and then they walk one at a time into they appear to walk into the center of the bull ring and read letters to you. And that installation is an example of moving from the field and the performance to the museum.
Well, and certainly just to bring up something, and then I think maybe you should just present the next project and we'll just open it all up for everybody. But, certainly just to say, I know that when you did the show with SF MoMA that there was a whole research part of that. How do you bring social practice art, particularly your art, into a museum context? And I think maybe something valuable to hear about is also why you feel that's important. And certainly, because I think, it maybe some people of our ilk might write off museums, or why even care about that? So maybe you could also speak to that.
Yeah, and I think that is a decision of practice, but in each one's individual practice. So the next project of these three, the second one is called The Circle and the Square, and it's in above Manchester in a small town called Briarfield. Now, this is a textile mill area that was in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, progressively deindustrialized. And now it's left as a rather poor community, not community, but it's the Lancashire area, series of poor towns. That's what they call Northwest England, which is the more impoverished part, mostly the more impoverished part of England. And it's filled with all these abandoned textile mills, which are slowly being reconverted. The other thing interesting about this region is that in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they deliberately imported people from Pakistan, and because they were people who understood textiles, and they incorporated these people into the mills as workers in the mills. And while I wouldn't say that the communities became bosom buddies, they were integrated within the space of the mill. And but since the mills had closed down and there was very little work, what had happened is the communities grew increasingly apart. And this is the mill that I worked in, this the Smith nephew mill. And it was abandoned, but it was in the process of being redeveloped for more high-end, sort of bedroom community housing from the city of Manchester. It's an hour away. And what we were worried about is that that you would create an increasingly impoverished class of people who were largely Muslim. After the mills closed, there was really virtually no socializing space that brought the white, formerly British, with the newly arrived Pakistani people together. They don't worship together. They don't go to pubs together. They don't go to restaurants, and they have, to some degree, different family practices. So we were looking at how this redevelopment of this mill and the region in general could, it would be important for developing the economy of the area to begin to facilitate bringing together the Muslim culture and the white British culture back in, in the space, symbolically in the space of this mill. So we worked for 3 years on a project that included the process of the reconstruction of the mill and letting local people into that reconstruction process. Here they are actually witnessing through the door of through the door of one of the buildings. And just to remind you also that during that time, there was a lot of terror about terrorism in this region, which was sort of known as a hotbed for Muslim activism. And so there is a lot of prejudice that is occurring in this region and throughout England around Muslims and Pakistanis. So as per usual, I worked together with teams of people, created dinners, sort of over the course of 2 years, began to plan this 3-day performance. And one of the things we did was we interviewed former mill workers in the space of the mill, I think about 75 of them. And then we took the metaphor of Muslim chanting and shape note singing. Shape note, which you'll hear in a minute, is an early Christian form of musical a cappella, musical worship, where people sit in a square. And this is my friend Ron Penn from Kentucky. Nato, this is the project that I had pitched.
I remember.
Yeah. So we ended up doing it in England. And this square is Ron coming over here and teaching people, Muslim and Christian, to do shape note singing. Sufis and Sufi chanters sit in a circle, and it too is a cappella. And this particular group I was working with are very into sort of thinking about preserving their customs, but also integrating socially and politically. And they were actually already doing a series of workshops with anybody who wanted to come on how to chant. So this is kind of the primary metaphor. Muslims, Christians coming together within the space of the mill, and sharing a cappella forms of worship, the circle and the square. So the way the performance itself worked after a couple of years of planning is there were 3 days open to the community and whoever else wanted to come, of tours of the old mill space, led by various people from the community. During these tours, there were spontaneous performances of chanting and nasheed singing and Kentucky violin playing in this case. The interviews were posted and the community was able to watch the setup of the performance that would take place on one day on Saturday. And that performance was essentially allowing people to sit in on a film shoot. So there were chanting, there were shape note lessons, chanting lessons, very small audience was allowed to sit in and witness the whole day. And at the end of the day, and this was very important, we held a dinner down that was run by people from the community in terms of, you can see Ralph Bashir standing in the middle of this large event. And what they are doing is they are, they're sort of, he's taking them through steps where they're sharing family photos and so on. There were 500 people that came to this, and this is probably the biggest event that's happened in this region, and was quite an accomplishment for the organizer, Paul Hartley. So now I'm going to show you a video of this, just a short teaser of this project.
Thank you.
So one of the things about So the question is, how does this then show up in a museum? And this project's got a lot of what I would call legs, having to do with the fact that there were very robust, growing community organizations that would take on the project. And so I'm just going to show you a 1-minute clip of its appearance in an exhibition at the Whitworth Museum, which people took, they brought this group of people continued to use this film as a way, this project as a way to fundraise. So you see some of the project and its documentation and so on.
Yes.
This is a project.
I
I'll
bet.
show you the images, but not the, can you see them? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, yeah.
This is on the border of Ireland during Brexit. We created a series of 5 events along the border where people tried to create yellow lines that would mark the border as the border was being reconfigured. One of them was kids in a kayak. One of them was runners. And
Cool. I like that.
yeah, it's a nice work. I wish we could see it more, but it's fine just to leave time for talking. Bridge where people are dancing across. This is the border, this river. Here's horses disappearing the border. And here's farmers adjusting bales of hay that create a border across field. We ended at Stormont, which is the capital of Northern Ireland, where we created a dinner that was conversation-led. At the end of the dinner, these are all people who live on the border, registered their votes, and we created from these votes the Yellow Manifesto. And that is their border perspective, because that's the perspective that was being lost in all of the, then we broadcast it on the site of the museum, and that ends up in the museum. I'll stop there and go back to sharing. So that in the museum is a very large installation with a photograph of all of those 130 people on the wall. It's a very nice installation, but in each of those cases, there's the work in the community and there's the work in the museum that is, as I said, different, but trying to be representative of the multivocality of the project.
First of all, let's give it up for Suzanne Lacy, everyone. I mean, hello, what? I mean, hello, what? So first of all, certainly feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. I will start by saying there's many questions in the chat, Suzanne. If you open it up, people have been chatting it up. Let's see here. What Colette asked, this is about the keto project, interested if the foundation did any studies afterwards to see if violence decreased afterwards, like
no.
any kind of follow-up study.
No. I mean, you can't expect an artwork to decrease social violence. Artworks operate symbolically. And if you're really sophisticated about community organizing, you can impact organizations, you can even impact policy, or you can enhance policy. You can spread it around, you can sort of create a better environment. But let's say 2,000 people came to the performance, probably another 1,000 were involved outside of that. And then it's been shown in various countries. How would you expect 2,000 people, and how would you measure whether 2,000 people experienced a difference in violence? The people I worked with it certainly changed attitudes, and I can document that. We went back, and there is on that project, there is a film of men made by a local filmmaker of men talking about their engagement with violence and their feelings about it and how the project transformed them. But that's 20 men.
Sure. Appreciate that. Cloudy, let's reunite you two.
Hi, Suzanne. So lovely to see you. So I just could ask a question, trying to make it really simple, but once again, I love the intimacy of your work and how it kind of just spreads out into this mass communication of sorts. And you know, I was going to ask you, you know, how those different ways of crossing over, you know, different aesthetic ways of communication. How, what is the spiritual element in all of that, if you can say something? Because I can see that it comes across really strongly. If you have something to say about that, because we never really talked about that in class. So I'm going to ask you now.
Well, I think for me as a Buddhist, spirituality is one, being in the moment, and two, listening to people's experience. And I find there's both a spiritual and an aesthetic dimension to that. I have dropped into conversations with strangers in the middle of another country, and you probably, any of you have had this experience of kind of all of a sudden a rather deep connection and an emotional connection, and you part and you don't see each other again. But to me, that kind of connecting based on compassion and listening is a form of spirituality. I don't practice Christianity. I was always a deeply spiritual kid, but I don't practice Christianity because I found too many problems with it as I grew older. And I'm even now finding problems with Buddhists in, you know, and they're in, I think, Myanmar. Buddhists are sort of leading the charge against the Rohingya. And that's shocking to me because I thought that that was at least one form of spirituality, which is not only espoused nonviolence, but in fact practiced it. However, most most religions that espouse nonviolence also practice it in one way or the other. And religion is used in various destructive ways. But so I think for me, going back to that moment of connection with another person, with nature, with animals, I connect with animals. You know, when I'm walking, I look right at them and there's a connection. And I think that that is a form of spiritual practice.
Well, I appreciate that. And thank you, Cloudy, for the deep cut in a question. Let's go over to Marion for a question. Welcome.
Yeah, hi. Huge fan, both of you. It's great to, I'm just reading your book, Leaving Art Again. But I guess the question is, I find the work very moving in a kind of nonverbal way, like the power of the collective singing in that space and the marching in yellow and the lights with the men telling the story. And it's almost like you're building an aesthetic out of community, which is it's very integrated. And I just was wondering if you wanted to talk about that at all. Does that make sense?
From the 70s, really, we've been talking about relationality in different ways. I mean, Capro talked about it in terms of the intimacy of what happens when two people are shaking hands, but there's this theater, the explosion of theater that's going on in the brain. And that sort of space between, like what Nato and I did between the door and the street, the space between me and Nato, really, that Nato, one of the reasons I did that project was my relationship with him, and that was significant to the project. So I think that, Marion, that spaces in between the relationships, the creation that we do when we talk to each other is sort of the materiality of my work. And the dilemma is it's also quite structural, and there's a lot of engaged practices within it. So the difficulty is communicating what is essentially a right brain and a left brain activity simultaneously. And the best show I think I've had in a long time was the one at the Whitworth. We had 3 major installations, the across and in between, the Shape Note and Circle in the Square and the Oakland projects. And they were all multi-screen video installations in very large rooms, very affective. But in the middle of the space, there were, each space was divided with a kind of choreography of data and information that created a resource library in a way for how the project was put together. There were documentaries. So you'd sort of walk down the middle and you could see how each of these were put together and the relationship between them. But then you would see the more affective presentation, because I've just shown you the, you know, the 3-screen, 2-screen videos, those things. But there were, you saw in one video, you saw large photos and a variety of other things that were part of the installation. So how do you show both of those, I think, is kind of, and
I
how do
appreciate the riddle. I mean, Suzanne, just to add in there, you know, certainly I always joke that, you know, you talk about this kind of the energy that moves between people, the becoming moment, this kind of incredibly powerful thing that you have to put so much effort in to construct, can be almost invisible, the energy itself, that exchange. And in fact, sometimes overarching aesthetic dimensions can almost diminish that energy because it becomes too spectacular. And so for a world trained on the eye and not trained on energy, there's a real battle that you're doing, which is to platform this human exchange in a way that isn't demeaning or being false about the most important part, which is that exchange.
Yeah, and I appreciate, remember the part in that little movie where you say, which I always disagreed with, in a sense, the for you, and I think one could make the argument that the piece was over before it began. And I'm still, and maybe that's old school, I'm still kind of driving toward that affective moment, that experience. But I think you raised the issue that, you know, certainly within your history, your research is, and I consider it still a dilemma and always would like to talk to you about it. It's sort of, how do you show that other stuff?
Right.
I had a problem with it in Russia. I was just doing a project before the invasion. For 3 years, I worked with Francesco, whatever his name was, and in that new museum, you know, that was being built by Michelson at in Moscow. It's called.
Oh, sure. I forgot the name of it. Yeah, it's like the big.
It was called Guest 2. So I did an elaborate, expensive project with them where we brought 3 different communities together with the workmen in the space electronically. And we were in the middle of preparing a 6-screen video installation to go right in the middle of that space when the thing, you know, when Putin invaded. And Francesco said to me, you know, in a sense, the project said what you did. In a sense, the project's already done. And my argument to him was, yes, but how do people know it, understand it, and kind of tactily feel the quality of the exchange? We did, in Between the Door and the Street, we did a ton of really good community organizing with a lot of relationships that were developed. One of the critiques that you and I had a problem with was a young student who thought we hadn't prepared childcare. And we spent a lot of time thinking about and working with those 150 organizers about childcare. And you know, we were never, and unless there was that 3-screen installation, how would you know that project, how would you, it's not even how would you know it, it's how would you reveal it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the struggle, and I appreciate that. And I don't actually mean that. I mean, certainly also it distributes, and not only do you make work for the community, you also inspire other artists to make work like that, which requires documentation. You can't just say you had to be there. Sorry. Wait, let's go over to Beatrice.
Hiya, I'm here in Dublin. As you can see, I'm wearing my repeal jumper.
Yeah, great.
I'm pretty sure the repeal movement was inspired by your work.
Yeah, I don't know.
I wonder whether you've met with any of the artists involved, like Alice Marr and.
I don't remember Alice per se, but you know, I've worked a lot in Ireland and I love Ireland. I've worked over the years in Ireland. I wrote Mapping the Terrain in Ireland.
Brilliant, brilliant. I was going to ask you a boring practical question, if you don't mind, about how do you develop these relationships through networks in different countries? Like, how do you tap into all these networks?
Well, you know, the key to organizing, one is a systems analysis. You go into a community and you basically create a map of the issues, the organizations. I often don't even come with an issue. I mean, I have a repertoire of things I have understanding of, but usually the issue is through community research too. But whoever invites me begins to build networks, and then I map the community and suggest organizing within these different territories. And in a large environment, you can't do everybody, right? You can't do every, I'm going to do a consultation with a group of people working in New York just about how to organize in LA, some partnerships around ecology. And you can't, so Lauren, I'll be talking to you about this. This is for Carrie Lovelace. But you can't get every nonprofit. So, you know, what you need to do is you need to think simultaneously about the meaning of each constituency and what they add. And then you have to think about the scale. Do you want one community organization, one school, one, you know, group of people within a city structure like in Quito? Or do you want a scale? So if you want a scale, how do you reach scale? And you reach scale by basically in the circle and the square. When I first started working with the organizer, Paul Hartley, he could organize a good showing of 30 people, half Muslim, half Christian. I said, well, we need to go to 500. And he was like, whoa, I don't know how to do that. So we basically I started teaching him how you move from intimate relationality to a larger scale. But the big question you have to ask is why. At each point, why and how do you want them involved? You don't just want a bunch of people because you want a bunch of people. That's really bad organizing. So one strategy, just intimate, there's hundreds of strategies, but one small strategy is you align agendas. So if I am meeting with Ralph Bashir and his Sufi group, I understand or try to understand where we come together. And in that case, he was very engaged with the idea of, well, he was starting a social welfare program. And so for him, making people's lives better economically and building a social relationality in the community, I said, that's great. That's an agenda I can pair with. So his agenda made my agenda bigger. And when I say there's never a my, it's almost always a team, right? So my means at least 6 to 8 people at the core of it.
Thanks, Suzanne. We're out of time. I want everyone to give a round of applause for Suzanne Lacy, who was absolutely incredible.
Thanks.
And I always feel like, you know, that simple question you asked, Beatrice, is actually one of the more insane lessons that Suzanne can lay down. It's basically community activism, art as guerrilla warfare. And so it has as many tactics as that, if not more. So certainly, thank you, Suzanne, for everything, your spirituality, your joy, your pleasure. We love having you here. We want you to teach here. As you know, I'm always trying to get you with us. Thanks everyone, especially for the questions. We didn't get to them all in the chat, but to the artists here working out there in the world, we really appreciate your energies. Thanks for joining us here at the school.
Okay, bye-bye.
Ciao.
Artists around the world, teaching artists around the